Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for this presentation. My name is Varshita Sher and today we are going to talk about performance consistency. That is the consistency in efforts or engagement levels that you put in. And we are going to talk about the role of performance consistency on student learning. This is done with the underlying knowledge that there has been a shift in recent times from a more traditional classroom to a blended learning environment wherein people use devices such as desktops and mobiles to engage in a learning task. Consistency in learning can be seen from a lot of different perspectives. In recent times, researchers looked at consistency across learning strategies. So for example, is the student pursuing a deep or a surface strategy throughout the course? They are also looking at consistency in learning across LMS login times. So is the student consistently logging in the system every week? And they're also looking at consistency across study times. So for example, in week 1, am I learning at, say, in the morning time only? And is this pattern being followed in the next week as well? And then in recent times, people are also studying consistency in terms of the SRL approaches or the self-regulated learning approaches. And what this means is that they are studying how consistent a student is when they are setting their goals, they are self-monitoring and metacognition and so on. We in particular are focusing on the time management aspect of SRL. Time management consists of scheduling, planning and managing one's time for studying so that we can allocate efforts depending on the intensity of work. Now, it is important to study the consistency in time management so we can understand how learners are regulating their efforts, setting specific workload for the week, and at the same time, making certain adjustments to their behavior so as to achieve those weekly goals as well. Now, what we know so far is that time management along with effort regulation can be highly predictive of academic grades. What we also know is that technology is changing the way learners are engaging with learning. And we see a lot of technology-enhanced learning environments emerging in the study space. These TELs bring into picture a lot of devices which can impact the consistency of study habits. So, combining these two sets of existing research, the challenge is now to assess the change in work patterns across the same activities. In other words, we are going to examine the within activity variance in online learning patterns when the students are using devices like desktops, mobiles, and tablets. In order to answer why the study matters, consider a small example where we are tracking a student's engagement patterns at two assignments, let's say assignment 1 and assignment 2. And for both of them, we observe that the total hours devoted are 40 hours. In theory, total performance efforts are same. But if we look closely at the distribution of these efforts in a week, we will see some major differences. For assignment 1, all efforts are concentrated on the initial days, which are marked by the green arrows. And there is some activity happening on the day of the deadline as well, which is the 9th, which is a Saturday. Whereas if you look at the second assignment, assignment 2, majority of the work is happening on the day of the deadline and a day preceding that. These observed inconsistencies in behavior of the time allocation and time management in general might be indicative of success and failure at a final level. This problem is more complicated because now we are not only interested in the days when this activity is happening, but also what modality was used. Since we do not know which modality was used in a day, we are also not sure if a combination of different modalities was used. And we are not sure that whether the same combination will be used in the next week as well or not. So these are some of the concepts that we are trying to target and get a more clearer picture of. So the research questions that we will be targeting in this study are as follows. The first question is, how consistent are students' work patterns from multiple modalities? And the next question is, can we find an association between these patterns and the academic performance of a student? To begin with, the methodology was quite simple and easy to follow. We first started recording the work patterns from assignments and discussion activity. How this was done was, for example, for a discussion whose deadline was December 8th, we start tracking the students' progress from 10 days before the deadline. So as you can see in this table below, D means desktop, M stands for mobile, and T is the deadline of submission. So for student 1, on 10 days before the deadline, we observed 2 accesses from desktop, and when it was 9 days before the deadline, we had 3 accesses from desktop and 4 from mobile, and so on and so forth. Once we have recorded the work patterns from these students, we can create a bidimensional time series for each student. Why a bidimensional series is because we need to have 2 dimensions. The first dimension will be the desktop dimension, which will track all the accesses from the desktop in particular. And the second dimension will be mobile to track the accesses from mobile in particular. So for the same student, if we are to create the bidimensional time series, we can simply split the desktop and the mobile views. So for example, for student S1, on the 9th day before the deadline, he had 3 accesses from desktop and 4 from mobile. And that becomes, in front of the desktop, we can just simply write a 3, and in front of mobile, we can simply write a 4. So this one over here and this one over here. And once we have created this bidimensional time series, we can repeat the above step for each subsequent activity. What that means is that we had a total of 3 discussions. So for each discussion, we will be creating this bidimensional time series. And for each assignment, so we had 8 assignments in total. And then we have to create similar kind of bidimensional series for each of these 8 assignments as well. So now, given that we have these, we have to consider how we can compare these bidimensional series. In order to measure consistency between these bidimensional time series that we have just created, we have to compare these series. So the question is, how can I compare these bidimensional time series to the ones that's below it? So series from discussion 1, how I can compare it to the series from discussion 2. There are a couple of ways that this can be done. The first is by using Euclidean matching. What this does is that it will match each point in time to the corresponding point in time, and this might work well for certain cases. However, if you see clearly, this won't match this red one, this red time series, to the blue one here. And the reason is that it cannot recognize that these two series are almost similar, just a little displaced in time. And therefore, Euclidean matching was not the best choice. We have another option, which is the DTW, which is dynamic time warping. I will not go into the details, but what it means is that this algorithm will detect similarity of 2 time series, even if they're slightly displaced in time, like these 2 are here. And therefore, our obvious choice for calculating the similarity between the bidimensional time series was DTW matching. And once we have this algorithm that we want to use, we can measure the similarity of time series that we have just created. And how so? That for each student, we will be calculating these 3 features, which is the similarity between their time series in discussion 1 and the time series from discussion 2. And then the second column, we will calculate the similarity between time series from discussion 1 and the time series from discussion 3. And in the last column here, we are going to calculate the similarity of the time series from discussion 2 and discussion 3. And this way, for each student, we can create a vector of these 3 values. And this was done for discussion. Since we had 3 discussions, we will be creating these 3 columns. We had 8 assignments in total, so we'll have a lot more columns in the second one, but the procedure is similar. We can do the same way for all the students as well. And once we have created these vectors, clustering of students is pretty straightforward. We are clustering students based on the similarity in their performance in subsequent activities. And this is how the clustering results from the assignment activity look like. On the x-axis, we have the DTW measure, which is the similarity measure. We have scaled it between 0 and 1 so that we can compare it easily. On the y-axis, we have pairs of assignments like assignment 1, assignment 2 at the very bottom here, followed by assignment 2, assignment 1, assignment 3, followed by assignment 1, assignment 4, and so on. So this D_7 refers to the assignment pair 1, 8. And then we start with assignment 2, assignment 3, assignment 2, assignment 4, and so on and so forth. So if you look closely on the x-axis, you have the DTW measures. And a smaller DTW measure means that the time series are quite similar to each other, whereas a larger DTW measure means that time series are quite different from each other. Now all the clusters that we have obtained, all these 5 clusters over here, are quite different from each other. For example, in cluster 1, over here, the red cluster, all the DTW measures are quite small and they're quite similar to each other, which means that all the time series are more or less similar to one another. Now on the contrary, if you look at the last cluster C5, we see that they have quite large DTW values, meaning that the time series in the initial assignments here are quite different to the later assignments. Now we are not sure why they are different. There could be a couple of reasons. For example, it could be because there was a change or a shift in the modality that they used. And by modality, I mean that maybe they were using desktops before and they wanted to switch to a mobile. Or the other thing can be that there was a sudden spike in the activity levels because of which the time series started to differ. Now, in order to understand why that was happening, we decided to plot, or rather plot the activity patterns of clusters in the form of time series. The first thing that I will mention is that we haven't plotted all the 5 clusters because we wanted to give just a rough idea, and we haven't done this for all the 8 assignments, just the first 3 assignments. And here we are showing you the time series from the desktops mainly, because we found that mobile was very sparingly used by a very few students only. And the black lines represent here kind of the centroid. A centroid of time series can be thought of as a median. So this is kind of the median of all the time series that you're seeing here in the black line. Now, if you look closely at the cluster 1, and if you remember, we saw that cluster 1 had a very small DTW measure for all the assignment pairs. And this is what we can see here as well. A small DTW measure means that all the time series were more or less similar, and that is what we can see in here. We see that for all the assignments, majority of the work is happening towards the end here, and same for assignment 2 and same for assignment 3. Whereas if you look at cluster 2, the time series for the first 2 assignments are quite similar in the sense that there was some work happening in the middle and then a little bit in the end as well, and same for assignment 2. But when it comes to assignment 3 and assignments after assignment 3, this strategy is changing and the work is now happening on the day of the deadline mainly, which is over here. So once we had created these clusters, these consistency profiles, we want to see if they have an impact or they can help us understand student differences. And we found that these temporal patterns are significantly associated with the overall grade, although the effect size was quite moderate, if not very high. And upon performing a post-hoc analysis, we found that majority of this significance was coming mainly from the fact that cluster 3 was performing the worst out of all the other clusters. And just to give a quick recap of what cluster 3 looks like, this is how it looks like. We call this cluster an incrementally consistent cluster because as you increment throughout the course, you can see the DTW measure is reducing. What this means is that the time series are becoming more and more similar as you progress in the course. So that was the differences with respect to the overall grade. We also wanted to see if if we can detect a difference for the assignment grade in particular. And we found that yes, there was some significant associations between these patterns and the assignment grade. And again, the effect size was quite small. Upon doing the post-hoc analysis, we had the same results as before, that cluster 3 was the worst performing out of all of them. But this time we also found that cluster 5 did significantly better compared to two other clusters. And this was how the cluster 5 looked like. So cluster 5 was the one which had the highest or the largest DTW measures, which means that their time series was quite different from how they were doing the initial assignments compared to the later assignments. So in the previous few slides, we talked about the results from the from the assignment activity. And now we are going to talk a little bit about the results from the discussion activity. And this is how the clustering of students from the discussion activity looked like. We had 6 clusters in total, as you can see on this right-hand side. On the x-axis, again, we have the DTW measures, which have been scaled between 0 and 1, so that we can easily compare them. And on the y-axis in here, this time we have the discussion pairs instead of the assignment pairs. So this one at the very bottom refers to the discussion pair 1, 2. The next one, which is D_2, refers to the discussion pair 1, 3. And the last one, which is D_3, refers to the discussion pair discussion 2, discussion 3. Now, out of all these groups, all these clusters that we had, the 2 highest performing groups were cluster 2 here and cluster 4. These two ones. Now, this is surprising because they both are incrementally inconsistent clusters. What that means is, as you progress in the course, they are becoming more and more varied. That is, the DTW measure is also increasing for C2 as well as for cluster 4. As you can see, earlier it was around 0.25 and later on becomes a little more around, say, 0.3 or 0.32. Similarly, we also did a few more analysis in terms of the overall grade and the discussion grade, and we found significant differences just like we did for the assignment as well. And overall, the highly consistent group, that is the groups where the DTW measure keeps on decreasing, for example, in cluster 5, you can see there is an incrementally consistent thing happening. So in most of these groups where this was the case, that they were becoming incrementally consistent, these were the groups which performed the worst. In fact, cluster 1 again was the one which performed the lowest out of all the other groups out there. Now, due to time constraints, I will not go into details about the prototype patterns like we saw earlier about the centroid, but they're all present in the paper and it has been described in great details in the paper. So for now, I'll come straight to discussing some of the conclusions that we can draw from this paper. So we saw that the most successful group of students in terms of the academic performance were the ones who were able to adapt and accommodate each individual task. And these were only a fraction of students, that is, the incrementally consistent learners, where the DTW measures were increasing as the course progressed. On the contrary, highly consistent students often did the very bare minimum that was needed to survive in the course. And the reason that they're called incrementally consistent is because they were consistently doing nothing. And this is surprising because literature has evidence that as learners progress in the course, their time management skills actually improve. However, we saw that increasing the consistency in their temporal work patterns was nowhere related to their deadline management. Thus, it is important that we ensure that increasing consistency is not linked to an improvement in learning. And this brings us to very major takeaway from this study is that many a times researchers are using proxies for learning, so proxies for consistency actually, and these proxies can be things like entropy or standard deviation of LMS activity measures like counts and time spans. And these can be misleading because we do not know if a low entropy is better compared to a high entropy. And finally, much like there exist some lecture-specific traits like length of a lecture or what's the title of a lecture, which can actually impact how much effort a student is putting in. There are also some activity specific traits that can affect student consistency. And what I mean by that is because we observed for assignment activity that all the profiles, all the 5 clusters that we obtained, they were converging. I'll show you an example. So this was how the clusters look like from the assignment activity. And if you observe carefully, all these 5 clusters are converging at some point. So for example, the cluster 5 is converging, and by converging I mean the DTW measure is decreasing. So this is converging at D_7, which is after the first assignment. And for example, this cluster 2 is converging, let's say, after the second assignment at D_13. But the common thing is that they all are converging at some point. So decreasing DTW, here also a decreasing trend, same for here, and there's a decreasing trend. So in short, they're all converging, just the matter that some are converging later and some are converging sooner. Whereas for the discussion activity, there were certain instances where the profiles were diverging as well. So for example, the 2 highest performing groups, that is cluster 4 and cluster 2. As you can see, both of them are diverging, which is the DTW measures are actually increasing. Same here, they're actually increasing. So thus, they are becoming more varied as the course progresses. And there is a continuing need to understand why this is happening. What is the nature of consistency? And when and why learners are actually breaking their patterns in order to opt for a widely varied work habit. This is something we need to understand. And finally, there is some interesting food for thought that was arising out of this study. Future work can actually assess what other activity-specific traits can we look at. For example, does the consistency depend on whether any group dynamics are involved in the task, or what are the assessment methods associated with the task, and some other things such as the role of instructional conditions on consistency. The second point refers to the external factors. So for our study, we assumed that students are giving equal importance, if not any less, to this course and to these tasks because they're really important and they're mandatory. But in reality, there can be a lot of external factors like heavy course load or their personal commitments, which can actually hamper these consistency work patterns. And we need to take them into account when we are doing future studies. And finally, this ongoing debate about variability versus consistency that we have for a very long time, that is it better to stick to a routine or should the strategies evolve with times and needs? So our study suggests that most successful group of students are those whose strategies, evolved over time and they adapted to the work patterns of each individual task. And as a result, the time series patterns were very different in each of these assignments. But having said that, other viewpoints may be needed before we can settle this ongoing debate, and we hope to see some work on this in future. Thank you so much for listening. Please email me any questions or queries that you had to this email down below. Thank you.